Hello and welcome to Media7, I'm Russell Brown. We live in an era where industrial disputes are played out in the media more than on the picket line, but the bitter Ports of Auckland dispute isn't so much a news story as a saga with its own sprawling cast of characters. Jose Barbosa looks back at the anger.
For more than 100 years, New Zealand's waterfront has been the focus of major industrial disputes. Strikes occurred in 1890 and 1913, but the 1951 dispute remains firmly lodged in the country's memory flange. Hastily enacted laws made it illegal to print or broadcast anything supportive of the wharfies' cause. Even before television, the government had rightly recognised that labour disputes in the modern world were, in part, contests for public sentiment. The current scrimmage between the Ports of Auckland and the Maritime Union is barely different. The dispute centres around the port's desire to restructure shift work. They want to move from an 8-hour block to 5 and 12-hour shifts. In return, dock workers would get a 10% pay increase. The union claims this will affect the job security of its members. They argue for keeping current rosters in return for a 2.5% pay increase over 6 months. And so begins a series of strike actions.
Union workers here at Ports of Auckland will down tools. They will go on strike for a 9th time.
Press releases are exchanged like competing jugglers. There's so much intrigue going on, the thing begins to resemble an episode of Game of Thrones.
The union members are threatening us, pissing in our lockers, and even on the barbecue.
They have been going around this town bad-mouthing this union, trying to belittle it to make it look bad because its own reputation is under such threat.
A union in New Zealand using international means to threaten New Zealand and its supply chain, I think it's atrocious.
The union takes the PR fight to the streets, or in this case, the internet.
People think it's all about money, but really, it's just about family.
And it has its own mid-season shock.
Ports of Auckland is making nearly 300 unionised workers redundant and outsourcing their jobs.
Local politicians on the Auckland Council rise to the occasion.
Stop smirking, Andrew. You don't need to smirk.
Oh, Madam Chair. This flagrant abuse of our CFO's got to stop. She's out of order. Get her out of the meeting.
What, you're going to call your goons?
No, I'm not. I'm just trying to get you to grow up and settle down.
Are you going to enforce that?
No, I'll go if that's what you want.
Well, that was what she's asked.
Right, we will put it by division that we have this item as an extraordinary item on the agenda. Actually, I can't put it because she's left the room.
Len Brown fielded accusations it was all his fault.
Absolute disgusting, his attitude in this, and the people of Auckland won't forget this.
Whose side are you on?
I'm on Auckland's side.
Yes.
The motivations and agendas competing for public approval, like the proposed port expansion, cross themselves so often in the media they form an opaque mire. And if all that's getting reported is what people say, has the big picture been missed?
Underlying the respective parties' rhetoric have been a whole lot of numbers. We could fill a whole show with them, but Sam Mulgrew fills up the sauce with a few of them now.
In October last year, a Ministry of Transport review into 6 of our ports found several things. Tauranga is our most efficient port. In 2 out of 3 measures, Kiwi ports beat Australia at efficiency, and we rate well internationally. But it also claimed for Auckland to become efficient like Tauranga, it needs to casualise the workforce and grow its land area. All this was in a report commissioned more than a year ago by the then Minister of Transport, Stephen Joyce. Combine this with Mayor Len Brown's order for the council-owned Ports of Auckland Limited to double its return on equity in 5 years, a figure which is incredibly high in comparison to other ports, and the battle lines were drawn. In order to prove their point that the stevedores were living at lush, Ports of Auckland also commissioned a study. It found on average wharfies got $91,480 last year, and for every 40 hours paid, just 26 were worked. The Maritime Union disputed the findings, noting the figure included non-wage costs and was based on more than 40 hours a week. The union turned down this final offer from the company, so Ports of Auckland disestablished 293 jobs, set aside $11.5 million in redundancy payouts, asked people to reapply on casual contracts. The dairy giant and shipping firm Maersk are taking $25 million worth of business down country as a result of the dispute. Despite some recent horrific press, the Port of Tauranga, Auckland's arch-enemy, is the dispute's biggest benefactor. Half-year profits are up 22%. Things are going so well in Tauranga, they've ordered a new gantry crane.
I'm joined now by Metro magazine editor Simon Wilson, author of a forthright editorial on the port controversy in this month's magazine, former Ports of Auckland Head of Corporate Affairs Karen Beanland, and the Director of the Industrial Relations Centre at Victoria University, Stephen Blumenfeld. Welcome to you all. Let's start with that editorial, Simon. You were pretty firm about your view that what the port was trying to do in the name of modernity was not in fact very modern at all. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's one of those arguments that you hear a lot in Auckland, that we are, as Len Brown says, trying to make Auckland into the most livable city in the world. We're trying to find a way in which a modern city can function well, can be good to live in for its citizens, good to work in for people with jobs, and good to make money in, and for all those sorts of things. And so there is a big battle going on in all sorts of areas about what modern means. Very often in the industrial relations area, modern has been used to mean you've got to privatise, you've got to take workers off collective agreements, and you've got to not have a workforce as such, and you have contractors and all those sorts of things. It doesn't have to mean that at all. If you're going to build a livable city, and this was the underlying theme of my editorial, if you're going to make Auckland into a livable city, then it's got to be a place that everybody who lives in it can feel it's great to live in, can work well, can have security of employment however that's possible, can aspire to a whole lot of values that are above and beyond the simple idea that a port has to make the maximum dollar at every point.
Would it also be fair to say that the Maritime Union has not been particularly modern either?
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. This dispute has been a long time coming. When the Tauranga port workforce was largely put out on contract, Auckland should have seen it coming, and in that sense, it's very clear that I think it's clear that the Maritime Union took some time to understand that they were really in an end game, that if they didn't find a way to win Aucklanders' hearts and minds, and New Zealanders' hearts and minds, and didn't find a way to say, okay, we want to be part of the future and therefore we can think flexibly in these ways, then they were going to be shown the door. And of course, it did take them some time to start thinking like that, and the Ports of Auckland therefore found it a little bit easier than they might have.
Well, with the help of Karen, of a PR army. I mean, you had disputes when you were there. Did you ever have two PR companies plus your internal comms team?
No, it was just me back then. Yeah, there was a significant dispute around 1999. And there are similarities to this in that in 1999 the Labour government had come in and we'd had the Employment Contract Act through the 1990s, and there was an expectation on the part of the unions and the government that they were going to repeal that and introduce the Employment Relations Act, and Auckland became the ground where that battle was fought. So the unions took a very strong position that they were going to do the pushback and claw back conditions and terms at that stage. So there were strikes then.
And you never felt the need to do blanket advertising across commercial radio. We've seen full-page ads. We've seen two PR companies on this. Why do you think Ports of Auckland have done that this time?
Because, as Simon said, I think this has been a very long time coming, and I think that Ports of Auckland has, if not decided a year ago that they would shift towards contracting out, that was always going to be Plan B. And I don't agree with the view that says this was their intention all along to go to contracting out. I think that from what I've heard of the company, there was a genuine intention to negotiate a collective agreement. I suspect that the management of the ports company has been under extreme pressure to get such a tight agreement that it may have been unrealistic. And I have to say that when the first strike notices were issued, I think last September, my heart sank because I knew this was going to be a very, very bitter and nasty dispute.
Stephen, I think it's quite clear that the Maritime Union had very little of the messaging and very little of the media for quite some time in this dispute. Did they get caught short?
Yeah, well, I think they definitely were surprised that this has gone on for so long. And they were surprised at the employer's response to their initial claims. But you're absolutely right. There was very little in the press from the union side until really after Christmas time.
And which was when the CTU got involved, maybe some of the grassroots labour people, and I think they've come up with quite a good brand for what they're doing. Now, the Save Our Port thing gives the public the impression that something stands to be lost.
Yeah.
I guess the irony there is that the people doing that are a lot of the people who got the vote out for Len Brown.
Oh yeah, it is quite an irony because Len Brown has obviously come out in opposition to the union's position in this case. And he very much depends on the support of Labour, I think, to win the next election, his next election.
Simon, why has Len Brown looked like such roadkill? Because he has not performed well.
I think Len Brown, I think there are a number of things that come together here. One of them is that Len Brown doesn't come from the industrial wing of the working class, of the labour movement, of course. So therefore he's not immediately or naturally sympathetic, perhaps, with the union claim. I mean, that's a part of it. He was deeply humiliated by the government at the time of the Rugby World Cup when if you remember, the opening night turned into such a fiasco, and Murray McCully, who was the Rugby World Cup minister and had been in charge of everything effectively, blamed Len Brown, and Len Brown, to his credit, stood up and took some of that blame. The only person who did, and that immediately got turned against him, and he was popularly held to have been responsible for an awful lot. That was deeply humiliating to him, and he doesn't want that to happen again. He doesn't want to be put in a situation where the government might say the Ports of Auckland situation is a fiasco, we're going to take over. So that's a really important part.
We'll pause now and be back after the break with more on that.